There are moments that sit quietly in the background, not forgotten exactly, but not fully understood either. Moments that, when revisited, don't just tell us about the past, but illuminate the present in ways that are, at times, deeply unsettling. The 1929 Hebron massacre is one of those moments. For many, it barely registers. A line in a textbook, a distant episode in a long and complex conflict. But for those who've studied it closely, it represents something far more consequential. It is not simply an outbreak of violence. It is an early expression of patterns, of incitement, of narrative, of moral framing that we are still grappling with today. Because what happened in Hebron in 1929 was not just physical violence. It was preceded by words, by rumours, by distortions, by the deliberate shaping of perception designed to inflame, to mobilise, and to turn neighbour against neighbour. A Jewish community that had lived in Hebron for centuries, long before modern political Zionism, was suddenly recast in the public imagination as an illegitimate presence, foreign, threatening, target. And once a shift like that occurs, once people are no longer seen as individuals, but as symbols of something different, violence becomes easier to justify. And that is the part of the story that matters most for us today. Because when we look at the world right now, we see something disturbingly familiar. We see how quickly narratives can form and how rapidly they travel, how easily complex realities are reduced to simple moral claims, and how, in that process, the line between criticism of a state and hostility to a people can begin to blur. The events of October 7 did not emerge in a vacuum, nor did the global reactions that followed them. To understand either fully, we need to understand the deeper historical currents, the moments where narrative, incitement, and identity intersected in ways that reshaped reality on the ground. And this is what this conversation is about. Yardena Schwartz, in her book Ghosts of a Holy War, takes us back to 1929. Not simply to recount what happened, but to examine how it happened, how stories were constructed, and how they spread, and how they created the conditions in which violence, seemingly at a time of peace, became possible. It is a work of history, but it is also a work of explanation. Because one of the most difficult things to grasp in any conflict is not just what people do, but what they believe to be true when they do it. The narratives they hold, the fears they are told to feel, the moral justification they are given. And once those narratives take hold, they can endure. They can be reshaped, repurposed, modernized, but their core function remains the same: to turn complexity into certainty, and to turn people into symbols, and ultimately to turn conflict into something inevitable. This is why understanding 1929 matters, not to relitigate the past, but to recognize the patterns that continue to shape the present, to see how disinformation and incitement are not new phenomena, but enduring tools, and to ask ourselves, quietly but seriously, what it takes to resist them. Because history, my friends, does not repeat itself in neat cycles, but it does echo. And sometimes those echoes are loud enough that we cannot afford to ignore them. So in this conversation, we're going back. We're going back in time to Hebron, to 1929, to the origins of a story that is still being told. And in doing so, perhaps better understand the one we are living through now. My guest is Yardena Schwartz. Yardena Schwartz is an award-winning journalist and author based in New York State in America, and just happens to be a fantastic person at the same time. She's written a book called Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. And we'll be talking about that book and its implications for where the conflict has landed, not only historically, but where we're up to today. Yardena Schwartz, welcome to Behind the Headlines, and thank you for joining us from New York.
Thank you for inviting me on, Adam. Great to be here.
Let's start a little bit about yourself and what drew you to write the book, Ghosts of a Holy War. What was that moment, emotionally or intellectually, that brought you to that moment to write about that mini war rather than any other element of the conflict?
Well, the book actually found me in a way because I didn't just one day decide to write a book about the 1929 Hebron massacre. In fact, before I started to work on this book, I knew almost nothing about that massacre. But one day in 2019, I got an email from a friend and a writer who I deeply admire, Yossi Klein Halevi, telling me that he had been approached by a family from Memphis, Tennessee, who had discovered a box of letters in their attic. And those letters had been written in the late 1920s by their late uncle, David Schoenberg, who had moved across the world to do what young men today do when, they're very interested in learning about Judaism and studying Torah, moving to the land of Israel. Yet this young man, David Schoenberg, did that in 1928 when that move was almost unheard of. And he left his family against the wishes of his parents. He moved to Hebron in what was then British Mandate Palestine, the second holiest city in Judaism, burial place of the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people. And the reason he moved there was because Hebron was at the time home to one of the most prestigious yeshivas in the world, the Hebron Yeshiva. And over the course of his years studying there, he wrote these beautiful, long letters to his family back in Memphis describing what life is like in Hebron. And his family discovered these letters in their attic almost a century later, not knowing that they were there because the memory of David was something that this family had kind of buried because he had been killed in the 1929 Hebron massacre. And that fact was just such a painful issue in the family that they just didn't talk about it. And his letters were just stashed away in the attic until this family discovered them in 2009, and they realized that they were sitting on a treasure trove of history because in reading his letters, they discovered that the Hebron that David lived in from 1928 until 1929 has ceased to exist. And the reason Hebron is what it is today, this family came to realize, and I came to realize through reading the letters and embarking on the journey I went through to write the book, archival research and research in Hebron itself, speaking with Israelis and Palestinians. I realized that not only was this very little known massacre pivotal to understanding how Hebron went from being what it was then to what it is today, but also pivotal to understanding the conflict itself and the forces that continue to drive it from 1928 through today. And I mean, all of that didn't happen in the span of that one email from Yossi, but Yossi said, this family has an amazing story. I think this could be a great book, but I can't write it for several reasons. Would you be interested? And, in a nutshell, I told him yes, but how do you write a book? And I'm so grateful to Yossi and to the family in Memphis, of course, for entrusting me with these letters and the telling of this story, but so grateful to Yossi for choosing me and then mentoring me throughout the 5 years it took to write the book. So I started in 2019, almost immediately after he introduced me to the family in Memphis, and the book was published about a year after October 7th, 2023.
It's a phenomenal book, and it's beautifully written, Yardena. So thank you for taking that 5 years to do it and
Yeah.
recommend it highly. You've talked about already, the Hebron before 1929 and the Hebron after 1921. Let's go back to the basics here for our audience who may not know the story, because the 29 massacre in Hebron is rarely understood. So take us back. What was life like in Hebron for Jewish and Arab people? And then what happened in 1929? Let's go and talk about that, and then we'll talk about the consequences of that. So let's start before, and then let's talk about the event. So what was life like in Hebron prior to 1928 when David Schonberg arrives at the yeshiva there?
So in David's letters, which he wrote in 1928, soon after arriving in Hebron, he described it as a place that had been frozen in time. These really ancient stone structures that seem to him to have withstood, thousands of years, to resemble what he imagined the land of Israel like in biblical times. That is what Hebron looked like. And not just David's letters depicted it that way, but, many of the books I read and, archival writings from Hebron at the time described it that way. And the Jewish quarter was this place where people lived almost one on top of the other. It was, this maze of homes built on top of other homes, and some people had to climb through the back of their neighbor's house to get to their own. And the Jewish quarter had been there for centuries before David arrived in 1928. And the Jewish community in itself had existed there for thousands of years, since the days of Abraham. Throughout its many eras of exile, the Jewish community of Hebron had remained, even in very small numbers. But, there had always been a Jewish presence in Hebron because it is the place where Abraham and Sarah and the matriarchs and patriarchs of the Jewish people are buried. And in 1928, Hebron was home to a very pious, very religious, traditional, quiet community of about 800 Jews, about half of them Sephardic and Mizrahi, half of them Ashkenazi. Many of the Ashkenazim were from Chabad, were followers of Chabad. And the Arab community, the Arab majority of the city, numbered about 20,000 people. So it was, very much an Arab city with a very small Jewish minority. But that Jewish minority lived in relative peace and harmony among their Arab neighbors. So Arabs and Jews lived side by side in Hebron at that time. They owned businesses together. Jews who didn't live within the ancient Jewish quarter often rented their homes from Arab landlords. Jews and Muslims attended each other's weddings and holiday celebrations. And David wrote about this in his letters, and I read, from other Jews who lived in Hebron at the time. I read their, books and letters as well, testifying to this.
You're describing a very tolerant, dare I use the word, idealistic sort of coexistence for hundreds of years, an Arab majority, a Jewish minority, living together, living in their own traditions, but sharing, caring. This is sort of like the ideal coexistence. Was there a history of any violence or intolerance that we know of before we get to this moment that you write about?
Yes. So I should say, despite all of that, it's important to note that Jews, while they were tolerated and relations were generally peaceful and there was camaraderie, the Jews who lived in Hebron were in many ways second-class citizens. First of all, they were forbidden from entering the tomb of the patriarchs from the 12th century, when, with the Islamic conquest of Hebron, the entrance to the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs, known in Arabic as the Ibrahimi Mosque, was only for Muslims. So Jews, Christians were forbidden from entering. And David described this in his letters, and other Jews living at the time described this, how the closest they could get was the seventh step outside of the shrines. So they did pray there. They did gather outside and prayed outside of the walls, but they couldn't go in. And if they tried to, they would be beaten, if not worse, by the Muslim religious authorities who controlled this holy place. And sometimes Jews who prayed outside would have rocks thrown at them by young Muslim worshippers who were gathered at the top of the mosque. Sometimes they would get cursed at. So it wasn't perfect. But Hebron was known as this beacon of coexistence, one of the safest places to be a Jew in Palestine. And it was for that reason that, well, that was one of the main reasons that Hebron was chosen as location for the Hebron Yeshiva. When the yeshiva had, because it had relocated from Slobodka, Lithuania to Hebron. And when the rabbis came to British Mandate Palestine from Lithuania searching for a place to reestablish themselves in the land of Israel, they were looking at Jerusalem. I think Petach Tikva was another one in the running. And ultimately they chose Hebron first because of its sanctity and its, holiness, but also its serenity and its kind of reputation as being this peaceful place where the yeshiva students would be able to really immerse themselves in the study of Talmud, in this place of utter beauty and serenity and peace.
As long as you accepted your place, right, as
Absolutely.
as a dhimmi, as a second-class citizen in that respect, and that there were restrictions. If you accepted that, then we have this idealistic sort of coexistence. Okay,
Absolutely.
so this guy comes and he goes to learn.
And I should say,
Yeah.
to answer your question about whether there had been violence, there had been a very violent attack against the Jews of Hebron in the 1830s when Palestine was ruled by the Ottomans. And it was an attack by Ottoman authorities against the Jews, in many ways a pogrom against the Jews of Hebron in, I think, 1834. And I believe in the 1500s, there had also been an attack, a violent attack against the Jewish community in Hebron. But what happened in 1929 was really, as I describe in the book, the first mass casualty event of what would come to be known as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which, of course, at that time, nobody was calling themselves Israeli, and Arabs in Palestine were not known as the Palestinians because everyone living in Palestine at the time was Palestinian, whether you were Jewish or Arab. And David, his letters are, postmarked Hebron, Palestine. When he would write about the young Jewish natives of Hebron, he described them as Palestinians. So it's really interesting, in so many ways, reading his letters in 2019 was kind of mind-boggling to kind of reassess the words we use and see how less than a century ago, so many of the terms we used meant different things then.
So you and I've seen it in other documents. You were a Palestinian Arab, a Palestinian Jew, a Palestinian Christian, or Palestinian Druze. There were all sorts of minorities with the headline Palestine as the national identity and your own sub-identity within. Okay, so
Right.
that's what it was in 1928 and 1929. I, we know the Jerusalem Post was first issued as the Palestine Post. So
I was just
got it.
going to say that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's all, at that point, it's all this headline, right?
Yep.
So David comes to the yeshiva. He's in this semi-idealistic framework. So long as you don't go into, the Mosque of Abraham, or, it is known as a mosque then, but it is the cave of the patriarchs as we know it. You don't go there, everything seems to be okay, right? And everybody's working together and at each other's ceremonies and life events, and it seems all peaceful and quiet. What happens?
So, over the course of a year, pretty much since the point when David arrived in Palestine, just after Yom Kippur of 1928, through August of 1929, when the riots of 1929 began, what happened was that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the most powerful Arab leader during the British Mandate, around the time of Yom Kippur 1928, he started to spread this rumor that the Jews of Palestine were plotting to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque in order to rebuild the ancient Jewish temple on the Temple Mount, and kind of raising this idea that the Jewish minority in Palestine was to be feared as a threat to Islam, and that Jews immigrating to Palestine were coming for this purpose, to kind of destroy Al-Aqsa and to help kind of just take over the land. And so before he started to spread these rumors and these lies and this incitement, the notion of Al-Aqsa being under threat, which is today still such a central, rallying cry within Palestinian society and the Palestinian cause. That lot was non-existent before 1928. Jews were praying at the Western Wall. They were forbidden again from entering the Temple Mount because it was Al-Aqsa. It was an Islamic holy site. It was ruled by the Islamic authorities, and at that time by the Grand Mufti. And the closest place they could get was the Western Wall. And what the Mufti did was he claimed that the Jews who were gathering at the Western Wall to pray in peace were actually doing so because they wanted to turn the Western Wall into a synagogue, and then from there use that synagogue to slowly creep over and take over Al-Aqsa. Since, according to him, he also claimed that the Western Wall is purely a Muslim holy site and that the Jews were trying to turn it into a Jewish holy site, despite the fact that Jews had been praying there for centuries, of course. Yet his propaganda campaign was just completely successful. And it's important to note that he had been appointed by the British, and yet the British did nothing to counter or stop this propaganda and this incitement. And because of his role as the most important Islamic official in the land, basically the equivalent of chief rabbi of Palestine, he also was in charge of all of the Islamic clerics and teachers and Sharia courts and Islamic schools. And so this campaign of disinformation spread throughout Palestine, throughout all of the mosques and cities and towns. And so in Hebron, for example, that disinformation campaign didn't just encompass what was happening in Jerusalem and, the supposed plot by the Jews to conquer Al-Aqsa, but the Muslims in Hebron were being told and eventually became convinced that the Jews of Hebron were plotting to conquer Ibrahimi Mosque, the Tomb of the Patriarchs, and turn it into a synagogue.
Okay. Hang on. We need to sidebar here 1 second. I want to pause because some of the listeners may not know the detail of this history. So I just want to sidebar for a second. We use the word Al-Aqsa in this conversation. Tell us, what is the Al-Aqsa Mosque? Where is it situated? Let's just go right back to the sidebar here so people understand
Yes.
what the inflammation of this is. And the reason I want to do that is the Hamas attack of October 2023. They called it the Al-Aqsa flood. So the name has a resonant, emotional, ideological, political tone right through Arab history from this time. So let's talk about what Al-Aqsa actually is. Take us into the detail of what it is and what the Temple Mount is all about. And then let's dissect that and then go back to Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who comes from the Husseini tribe, and why he was so central to all of this. So listeners, let's just sidebar this for a minute. Okay, so tell us about Al-Aqsa. What is it?
So Al-Aqsa Mosque is the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina. In Palestine, it is the most important Muslim holy site. It was built atop the ruins of both ancient Jewish temples, what Jews know as the Temple Mount, where the first and second temple once stood. And
So the first temple, again, the detail is the temple that history says Solomon built around the 900s BCE. Solomon builds a temple. That lasts till 586 BCE. And when Nebuchadnezzar comes, destroys a temple, the Israelis then, the Israeli League is exiled, and then they come back. King Cyrus of Persia, of which, of course, is ironic today, comes and frees the Jews from exile from Babylon.
Babylonian exile. Yeah.
Go and build another temple. And we do build another temple, and that temple is built and destroyed by the Romans eventually in 66, 70 in the Common Era, right? After Jesus, right? So there's 1,000 years, eventually, there's 1,000 years of two temples, and the Romans destroy the second temple. They flatten Jerusalem after the second revolt, and they change the name of the city of Jerusalem to, Yardena?
Palestine.
Well, they don't change the name of Jerusalem. They change the name of Judea.
Yes.
The name Judaism, the Jewish people, our name is derived from the land of Judea. That is our origins. And what the Romans did was they punished the Jews of Judea for their rebellion, the Bar Kokhba rebellion. They punished the Jews and sought to sever the connection of Judaism to the land, which was Roman land. They named it Palestina. And they named it
Philistines, the ancient
after the Philistines, the biblical enemies of the Jewish people who were not Arab. They were not natives. They were of this land. They weren't Canaanites. They were a biblical tribe that no longer exists. The Philistines no longer exist today. And it's interesting because at the time there were various Arabic newspapers. There was the Palestine Post for the Jewish community, and the major Arabic newspaper at that time was Philistine. So it was the Philistine, it was named after this biblical enemy of the Jewish people. And so Al-Aqsa was built.
Just to fill in the last piece. So it's Roman. There's nothing left of the Temple Mount, of the temples, and of Jewish administration or Israeli administration from Judea. Then the Arab conquest comes out of the 700 in the Common Era.
Right.
And they conquer Jerusalem. And what do they build on top of the Temple Mount, Yardena? Why is it Al-Aqsa Mosque? Why is that the third holiest place?
So it is considered the third holiest place because this is where, according to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad began his night journey. And the reason that the Mufti managed to convince Muslims that the Western Wall, the Kotel, the Wailing Wall, is holy to Muslims and that Jews shouldn't be praying there is that during his night journey, according to the Mufti, the winged horse that Muhammad took for his night journey to heaven was tied to that wall. That wall, the Western Wall, is the reason it's holy to Jews is that it's the last remnant that's still standing today of the Second Temple, the retaining wall of the Second Temple. And so at that time and to this day, Al-Aqsa holds this very kind of central role in not just the Palestinian psyche, but the Muslim psyche, because this was kind of a symbol of the Muslim domination and conquering of Jerusalem, the Holy Land, a place that was already holy to two religions before the creation of Islam and before the Islamic conquest of Jerusalem.
So hundreds of years before the Mohammedan conquest of what is essentially, Judea / Palestine, there's the Jewish history, and of course there's the Christian history. 700 years before, with the birth and death of Jesus there, along come the Arabs. They conquer it. It's the part of Muhammad's night journey. So they build the mosque, which is a silver dome mosque, which you see there, which is called
Golden Dome. Sorry, the
Golden Dome is, there's two mosques up there. There's the silver dome and
sorry, right. Right.
Right.
Dome of the Rock is the
The
gold.
Dome of
Yes.
the Rock is the Golden Dome, and the
I
silver.
thought you were referring to that one. Yes.
Yeah, and the Silver Dome, right. And
Mhm.
fast forward now to the British Mandate. So hundreds of years later, the Ottomans, the Arabs conquest and the Ottomans take over. We get to the Grand Mufti, who's, I like your description, the chief rabbi, but the chief Islamic vizier of Palestine at the time. And he spreads this rumor because Jews are starting to come from Europe, right? This is the movement away from the pogroms of Europe and the early settlement. This is the Zionist movement of the settling of our ancient homeland, the return of exiles.
Mhm.
And he arcs up and decides to fight this with these rumors that the Jews are going to take over Al-Aqsa, which is a religious, centrally religious important element. And because,
Mhm.
if I'm getting it right, Yardena, I'm summarizing, he's got control of the mosques as the chief. This conversation is going everywhere. The Jews are about to take over. And but the British are controlling the immigration, but they're still coming from Europe.
Mhm.
Here we are. We're at 1928. David is now arrived in the yeshiva. He's hearing of these rumors, and it gets magnified in Hebron that they're going to take over the Mosque of Abraham, which in our language is the Cave of the Patriarchs,
Yeah.
and things start to rumble. Okay, we're back in time now to where we were. Thank you for that sidebar of history. What happens now?
So the tensions had been brewing in Jerusalem for about a year at this point, and then comes Tisha B'Av, the ninth of the most somber day on the Jewish calendar, when Jews commemorate the destruction of both ancient temples in Jerusalem. And just as they had in years past, on the eve of Tisha B'Av, thousands of Jews gathered at the Kotel, at the Wailing Wall, to pray on the holy day that gave the Wailing Wall. This is August 1929, mid-August 1929. And that evening, when they're praying at the Kotel and David is there, the Jews who are praying at the Kotel are surrounded by mounted British police who are there to protect them from what had started to become near daily attacks by Muslims on Jewish worshippers of the Western Wall as a direct result of the Mufti's disinformation campaign. The next day, so no one's hurt. No Jews are hurt that night, only because they're surrounded by horse-mounted British police. The next day, hundreds of young Jewish activists, Zionist activists, marched to the wall to protest against the British failure to protect Jewish access to the Western Wall, which had not only had the Mufti been spreading these lies, but he had also worked to limit Jewish access to the Western Wall. He had these building projects started at the wall where they added a part of the wall to the top where stones were falling on the heads of Jewish worshipers. He had a doorway built into the Western Wall to allow Muslims to go through the wall and up to Al-Aqsa, thus increasing the frequency of tensions and attacks on Jews by Muslims. And so this march to the wall was politically provocative. They were chanting, "The wall is ours, restore the wall." They were singing Hatikva, what would become Israel's national anthem 20 years later. They were carrying flags bearing the Star of David, what would become Israel's national flag 2 decades later as well. And yet, despite how politically provocative their march was, it was entirely peaceful. No one was hurt. And yet, according to Arab leaders and the Arabic press, the march was not peaceful. They claimed that the marchers had attacked Muslim men, raped Muslim women, cursed the Prophet Muhammad. None of that was true. Yet, after a year of propaganda and disinformation, the truth had become irrelevant. And it was believed as fact. And there were attacks against Jews in Jerusalem out of revenge for this supposedly violent march. And then there were counterattacks by Jews against Arabs. And so there were these attacks and counterattacks for the next week in Jerusalem. And then on August 23rd, 1929, Friday prayers at Al-Aqsa, Muslim worshippers had been instructed to come armed in order to defend Al-Aqsa from the Jews. And because this peaceful march to the Western Wall was basically depicted as the proof of the Mufti's claims that the Jews were plotting to conquer Al-Aqsa, and this was the proof. Here, they're calling for the British to give them the wall because, as I mentioned earlier, this was essentially Muslim property. It was owned by the Muslim Waqf, which today still oversees the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa. And so after Friday prayers that day, thousands of armed Muslim worshippers descended from Al-Aqsa down to the old city of Jerusalem, attacked and killed Jews, set fire to Jewish businesses, and the riots just ricocheted throughout Palestine. And that very day, on Friday, August 23rd, 1929, a man on a motorcycle arrived in Hebron from Jerusalem, telling the Muslims of Hebron that Arabs in Jerusalem were being slaughtered by Jews and that Muslim blood was filling the streets of Jerusalem. And he said that it is up to you, the Muslims of Hebron, to defend your brothers in Jerusalem and to take revenge on the Jews of Hebron for what their Jewish brothers are doing in Jerusalem. And so all of this disinformation, the claims of a Jewish plot to destroy Al-Aqsa, claim of a Jewish plot to take over the Ibrahimi Mosque, the Tomb of the Patriarchs, this claim that Jews were slaughtering Arabs in Jerusalem, all of this led to this horrific massacre that took place the very next day in Hebron. It began actually that day, and Friday, August 23rd, it was hundreds of Muslims in Hebron marching through the streets, throwing rocks at Jewish homes, beating up Jews. One yeshiva student was killed inside the yeshiva that very night, but it was the next day that saw the worst of the atrocities.
Your book details this, literally person by person attack and room by room what happens. In summary, what happens the next day, Yardena? What happens that this incitement just sort of breaks out into a violent assault on the Jewish community? What happens?
So early morning, Shabbat morning, August 24th, 1929, all of the Jews in Hebron are trembling in fear inside their homes. Their doors are locked, their windows are shut. They're just hoping that the mobs outside will spare them. But one by one, nearly every Jewish home is broken into by thousands of Muslims. It was about 3,000 men that took part in this massacre out of a population of 20,000 Arabs, 3,000 men armed with swords, axes, daggers, machetes went from house to house, stabbing, torturing, raping, in some cases castrating yeshiva students and rabbis, mutilating men, women, and children, setting fire to homes, burning families alive.
Are you talking about October 7, 2023 or August 29? What I just want to
August 24th, 1929. And it's chilling. The parallels are chilling. If the parallels were only the atrocities and the cruelty and just the horrific ways in which people were killed, Dayenu. But the chilling parallels go well beyond that. But we can just speak to those parallels. In 1929, it was 67 unarmed men, women, and children who were butchered to death over the course of about 2 hours on that Shabbat morning. And it was also known as the Black Sabbath, just like the Shabbat of October 7th would come to be known as, the Black Sabbath. And yet, despite the fact that nearly a century later, on October 7th, many more people were killed, in a way, the atrocities committed against this peaceful Jewish community in Hebron in 1929 was almost more horrific for several reasons. One, unlike October 7th, none of these people were killed with guns. They were killed in the most intimate of ways, with limbs chopped off. People used axes and machetes to kill children, and these people, in many cases, were being killed by their neighbors. In some cases, they were pleading with the mob not to kill them, and they were calling out people by name, saying, "How could you do this? We've lived here all our lives." It was also, in a way, more horrific because, yes, there were warnings that were ignored before October 7th, but they were ignored by the political establishment, by the government, by the military. In 1929, it was the Jewish leaders of Hebron themselves who had rejected offers of help from the Haganah, who had come to Hebron in the days before the riots erupted, saying, "Something is going to happen. We think there's going to be a pogrom here. We want to get the Jews of Hebron out to safety or come here and defend you." And the Jewish leaders of Hebron were unanimous in their opposition. They said, "No, your presence here will only encourage suspicion. We trust our Arab neighbors. The Arabs of Hebron are our friends. They're not our enemies. They'll never hurt us." And they were so sure of that because in previous years, when there had been outbursts of violence and outbreaks of violence or attacks on Jews in other parts of Palestine, those attacks did not reach Hebron because of this history of coexistence and these, really genuine relationships and friendships that had existed there. And so the Jewish leadership of Hebron was just sure that that would be the case now. And they said, what will happen there won't happen here. And their Arab friends were telling them this. They were saying, if anything, if anybody comes here from Jerusalem to hurt you, we will be here to protect you. And those promises that at least
some did, it's fair
Yes.
to say.
Yes, at least 200 Jews were rescued from the massacre by their courageous Arab neighbors and friends. So while 67 were murdered, at least 200 were saved by just 24 families. It didn't take many people to save that many lives.
So on that Saturday, we've got 15% of the Hebron population, it's 3,000 out of 20,000, rioting in the streets of Hebron, specifically in the Jewish quarter or Jewish area. They go in and they're massacring people. Doesn't matter what age, doesn't matter what gender, they're killing them. But about 20, you said 2 dozen, so 20, 22, 24, I forgot the number you've got in the book, take their Jewish friends and they save them. They exit them out of Hebron.
Well, they don't bring them out of Hebron. So I think there was one family that did that, but in most cases, what they did was they hid Jews inside their homes, or some of them actually stood guard outside of Jewish homes, pretending that there were no Jews inside, or in one case, actually saying, if you want to get to the Jews inside this home, you'll have to do so over my dead body.
Okay. So that's where we're different from October 23, but everything else you're describing, Yardena, it's, the word that comes to mind that this is not just an eruption of violence, it's like it's a template. The parallels are huge. They're significantly the same. This incitement, Al-Aqsa flood.
Language that was used by the rioters in 1929 was almost exactly the same language that we heard in the hundreds of hours of footage that the terrorists posted themselves to social media on October 7th. If you were, unfortunate enough to watch that footage, they're not shouting "Free Palestine." They're not shouting "End the occupation." They're shouting over and over again, "Allahu Akbar."
I saw it. I saw
God is great.
footage, and
Yes.
people don't understand, I don't think, the inherent religious nature of what is going on here. It's seen as merely a political conflict, but it is so much more. The question I wanted to ask,
And I should say, in 1929, this is also what the rioters were shouting. They were shouting "Allahu Akbar." They were praising Allah and claiming to be killing Jews in defense of Al-Aqsa, just as they were on October 7th.
Dana, the central question of this, and I'll come back to that, the template. I mean, who are the people in October 23 that the Gazans killed first. The kibbutzim and the towns around Gaza were the people who were the transporters of Gazan people into Israel, the people who were taking them into hospitals, the people who believed in coexistence by living family to family together, sharing and helping one another. And they were the first killed. So that the parallels are extraordinarily close.
Right.
What is it? What in your research here, what is the spark or the moment or the pattern that turns people who've been living for centuries family to family all of a sudden into enemies? Do you have the answer to that conundrum?
Disinformation and incitement and dehumanization, when you take the humanity out of people and you depict them as threats to your religion. And for a population that is so devout and so traditional, and for whom Islam and it is their identity, and these are communities that are very devout, very religious. And sadly, in Palestinian society, there is a glorification of jihad and a belief in the virtue of violently defending Al-Aqsa and Islam. And I think, for many people, that is hard to wrap your head around, especially for Westerners. I personally had no idea that this Islamic fundamentalism, this belief in defending Islam with your blood, was something that Palestinians believed in. I had not heard that before. And yet, when I started to ask these questions, Palestinians I spoke to were very open about it, didn't hide it. It's just I hadn't been asking that question, and I hadn't been looking at that kind of force in the conflict because I didn't know. I didn't understand. I had never known about this lie about Al-Aqsa. I mean, I had known that the Second Intifada was called the Al-Aqsa Intifada, but I thought it was just because it erupted at Al-Aqsa, because of Ariel Sharon's visit to Al-Aqsa. And I think many people don't comprehend why that visit sparked so much violence. And it is because of this lie, because it, again, fed into this claim that Israel is out to destroy Al-Aqsa. And I think that on October 7th and in the days after, all of us were shocked and disoriented and just didn't understand how this had happened. But there was a part of me that was even more shocked because I suddenly saw that this disinformation campaign from 1929, it is still running the show. It is still driving so much violence and so much cruelty. And I think that if you look at pogroms throughout the centuries in Europe, they were also driven by disinformation. Whether it was in England or in Europe, it was, the claims about Jews killing children to drink their blood. I mean, it's so much of this senseless violence stems from propaganda, lies, disinformation, and the massacre of 1929 absolutely followed that formula.
So the story of Hebron then is one of a fragile coexistence. It's contingent. That coexistence is a very contingent thing that is easily vulnerable and easily ruptured. And it seems to be that that's the template. That's the continuation. Even when there is a peaceful resolution attempted like Oslo, out of that comes the Second Intifada, which is a very planned, and it's not just Ariel Sharon visiting
Right.
Al-Aqsa. That's like the march, as you described it in
Exactly.
1929. We're marching through the old city because we're prideful of who we are, but we're not going to be violent. But it triggers this emotional outburst, this religious outburst. And here we have Gaza, same sort of thing, the Al-Aqsa flood. Peace is fragile, it's contingent, and it's easily ruptured. And we live in an age of, easily bent narratives. You use the word disinformation a lot. I'm going to add the word misinformation.
Yeah.
Purposefully misdirected.
Right.
So do you now see the story of Hebron being reframed within this larger modern discourse now about Israel and Palestine?
It's interesting because, before I started working on this book, I had only been to Hebron once. And the time I spent there had been so depressing that I had never wanted to return. I had been there in 2011 before I had moved to Israel. I moved to Israel in 2013. But in 2011, I went to Hebron as part of a trip to Israel as a student at Columbia Journalism School. We were there on a 10-day trip, my whole class. I mean, not the entire class at Columbia Journalism School, but my class was a covering religion class led by Professor Ari Goldman and the author Gershom Gorenberg, our adjunct professor. And one of the days we spent in Israel, we went to Hebron and we spent time in Kiryat Arba. We did a tour of Hebron with Breaking the Silence. We met with the spokesperson for the Jewish community of Hebron. And just the feeling I got being in Hebron that day was so disturbing, because Hebron today really is this microcosm of the conflict. You do see the military occupation of the West Bank up close in a way you can't really see elsewhere. Soldiers are on every street corner. There are checkpoints on every street almost. There's almost no view you can have in anywhere in Hebron without seeing barbed wire. And so,
If
you know,
if you're Israeli or Jewish, because
if you're on the Israeli side of
you're
Hebron,
on the
right, on the Israeli side of Hebron, on the Palestinian side of Hebron, which is 80% of Hebron, so most of Hebron is not controlled by Israel, it's controlled by the Palestinian Authority. More than 250,000 Palestinians live in Hebron. But on the Israeli side, because there is this community of 800 Jews living among 35,000 Palestinians, and there have been just for many years, many terrorist attacks in Hebron. And, during the first intifada, during the second intifada, Hebron was, one of the epicenters of attacks. So the military presence in Hebron is so strong, especially surrounding the Tomb of the Patriarchs, because they need to ensure that Jews, Muslims, tourists can enter the Tomb of the Patriarchs freely and safely. But it just felt to me like this military complex, like a military fortress. I wasn't able to feel in Hebron like I was walking through this holy place. And that really was devastating to me when I was there in 2011. And I think that today, Hebron and the Jews living in Hebron are depicted in kind of, many media narratives and in conventional wisdom. The Jews living in Hebron are these violent settlers, radical, racist people. And I found from my time reporting in Hebron for hundreds of hours and meeting with dozens of Israelis and Palestinians in Hebron that most of the Jews living in Hebron are not violent and they're not radical. Many of them really are just like anyone else. They want to live their life in peace, but they're very religious and they are very, devout themselves. And the reason they want to live there is to be close to the Tomb of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs. Many of them pray there every day. And they want to be able to do that in peace without their presence necessitating violence. And, you know, the Palestinians I met with in Hebron, it was interesting because I had gone in thinking that I would be shocked by the things that I would hear from Jewish residents of Hebron, but I was actually much more shocked by the claims I heard from the Arab residents of Hebron, who told me that Jews have no right to live in Hebron, that there is no Jewish history in Hebron, that Abraham was not Jewish, that the Tomb of the Patriarchs is a Muslim holy site that Jews have no right to pray inside. The mayor of Hebron well, he's now in prison, but he's now in his second term as mayor of Hebron. He was a convicted terrorist who committed in 1980 what was at that point, the deadliest terrorist attack in the West Bank. And not only did he show no remorse for his attack, but he claimed that he had targeted soldiers who were all armed. That was not true. He,
This is a
you know,
really
they
difficult, the conundrum is the denial of the other. And inside that denial is a very limited possibility of coexistence, right? Free of violence that surrounds it. I remember going myself to Hebron some years ago with a friend of mine, and he took his gun with him just in case. And we went to Kiryat Arba, the Jewish settlement, and we went into the cave or the tomb of the patriarchs. And I remember he walked me around the streets where we were able to walk. And
Mhm.
Yardena, I'll never forget the faces of the Arab Hebron residents had a look I can only describe as hateful. It really frightened me. It really shocked me that I could see beneath the surface, and I'm not going to the moral claims and the rights and wrongs, and that just this look of you don't belong here and you shouldn't be here. And if we had our way, none of you would be here. I felt it at a visceral level. I did see it in some of the Jewish residents too, which was,
Hmm.
that there is no opportunity for peace here, and we need to be military encamped in order to claim our religious heritage. It's a litmus test. Hebron for me is a litmus test of everything that is wrong in the Israel-Palestine narrative. The denial of
Absolutely.
the other, the denial of history, the denial of fact, the willingness to be incited and misunderstood. Where does this lead? Where does this lead us, Yardena? If it's the microcosm of all that's wrong, then it will always be there. Where does this lead us in this future of two people, traumatized people living on the same land?
Well, I hope that Hebron does not become a blueprint for the rest of the West Bank or Israel itself, because if that is what we need to be safe, to be surrounded by soldiers and checkpoints and barbed wire, I mean, is that worth it? I mean, I just think there has to be a better way. And that way is, in my mind, not military, it's reconciliation, it's sitting down with the other and, talking to each other. Because what I found in my conversations with Palestinians and Jews in Hebron was that they were actually very similar. They're all living there for the same reason, because they revere God and Abraham. Abraham is the patriarch of the Jewish and Arab people. In Islam, Ibrahim is a prophet. That's why the mosque's called the Ibrahimi Mosque. And it really struck me that, rather than that shared heritage, that shared holiness being a source of hatred and violence, it could very easily instead be a source of camaraderie and harmony and cooperation. And there was this one family, a Palestinian family living across the street from Jewish families. And in both homes, they both go to the Tomb of the Patriarchs every day to pray on, opposite sides of the Tomb of the Patriarchs. And they both have, they grow, one of them, the Jewish family, grows wheat in their backyard, and the Arab family has olive groves in their backyard. And I just thought, what if instead they, harvested olives together and made olive oil together? And, instead of having, these centuries old fights over who this land belongs to, if we could just embrace that it's for all of us. It is the homeland of both peoples. And, of course, this might sound naive to some, but in the museum of Hebron, on the Jewish side of Hebron, on the Israeli side of Hebron, where the Jewish community has a room commemorating the massacre of 1929, but also all of these other rooms that kind of tell the story of the entire history of Hebron. The Arab history of Hebron, the Muslim history of Hebron is there too. It's not overlooked. It's not erased. And in that room commemorating the massacre, there is a part of one of the walls, a part of the wall, there's parts dedicated to the victims and telling the story of what happened. And there is a part, one of the walls is dedicated to those courageous Muslim neighbors who saved the lives of their Jewish neighbors. And I was really sad to learn from all of the time I spent on the Arab side of Hebron, that feeling, that sentiment of being able to embrace all of the history of Hebron and to, commemorate and honor the Muslim history of Hebron. There is none of that on the Muslim side for the Jewish history of Hebron. On the Muslim side, everywhere I went, whether it was, a plaque telling the story of Hebron in English for tourists in Hebron or museums on the Arab side of Hebron, none of them, they would tell, the history of Hebron dating back to, the Bronze Age. They would tell all of the history of Hebron, thousands of years, never including the Jewish history of Hebron. Nothing about the Jewish community of Hebron. The only time Jews entered the story, if they did, on the Arab side of Hebron, it was as the Zionist entity or the occupation in 1967. So a tourist going to Hebron, only to the Palestinian side of Hebron, would come away believing, as many millions of people do around the world, as we now know, believing that Jews are foreign occupiers in Hebron, that they had never lived in Hebron or this land, that Jews only lived there as settlers, as invaders. And so it makes you realize, okay, well, when millions of people are taught that that is what Jews are and that's what Israelis are, then you can understand why they're perpetrating violence against Israelis. I mean, you would too. I would too if I was taught that. I mean, I wouldn't be killing people, but I would certainly hate people who I was taught from a young age are here to just take my land and have no right to be here.
Yeah. So, living so deeply inside this history, how has it changed the way you see the present? Because you said, from 1967, when Israel, you know, conquers the West Bank after that war. So if you start there, you get one conclusion that Israelis, Jews are foreigners, right? But if you start in 1929, that history, you get another view, understanding that the Jewish connection to the land is long, 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 irrespective of what, propaganda is put up. So where should we start the story, Yardena, and who gets to decide where we start that story?
Well, I think one thing I have learned, not only since writing this book, but particularly since October 7th, is that we as Jews, especially Jews in the diaspora, we don't know our own story. So many of us believe the lie that this conflict, began in 1948 or in 1947 and the story of the Hebron massacre really just undercuts so much of the conventional wisdom about this conflict because, there's so many people who argue that, October 7th was enabled by the suffering of the Palestinians. Okay. People around the world are suffering. They're not going out and massacring their neighbors. But even if you were going to believe that it was justified because they were oppressed, well, how do you explain that 2 decades before the state of Israel was born, when Jews in Palestine were a weak minority in a majority Arab country, there was no state of Israel in 1929. There were no Israeli soldiers. There was no IDF. There was no oppression of Palestinians. Jews were in many ways second-class citizens still. And yet still they were massacred. I just think that the fact that so few people and so few Jews know about this history is a testament to how much we have failed to teach our own history to our own community. Because let's be real about this. Anti-Semitism is not going anywhere. People have always hated Jews. They will continue to hate Jews, but Jews shouldn't hate Jews. And one of the reasons why I believe so many young Jews have succumbed to the lie of anti-Zionism and the disinformation that drives anti-Zionism is because they didn't have the facts to protect them from buying into that disinformation. So if they believe that, Israel was just created in 1948 and they don't know about the long history of a Jewish presence in the land of Israel before that, and the attacks that were carried out against Jews in the land of Israel before 1948, and the embrace of the Jewish community of a binational state. We didn't get to talk about this, but I write about this in my book, how the Jewish community in Palestine in 1928, the Zionist leadership was supportive of the idea of sharing this land, supported the idea of a binational state, of self-governance of Palestine by the Arabs and the Jews of Palestine. And it was the Arab leadership that rejected that, not just the Mufti, but other Arab leaders as well rejected that idea, because for 1,000 years under Muslim rule prior to the British Mandate, Jews were second-class citizens. They were dhimmis. They didn't want Jews to become equal. If it was going to be self-governed, they insisted it would be an Arab government. Jews would be a minority, a tolerated minority, but nothing more. And so I think that so many of the conversations today about how, we just want, people like Peter Beinart saying, well, Israel should just be a place where Jews and Arabs can live side by side in peace. And, well, okay, we wanted that. That's was something that the Jewish community embraced. And as we can see from the rejection of every two-state solution from 1937 to this day, that is sadly not something that the Palestinian leadership or other Arab states have been interested in. So I just think people really need to learn this history to better understand how we got to where we are today and how we can get out of this endless cycle of violence, because clearly the role of disinformation and incitement has claimed too many lives and has also been far too ignored as a driving force out of the conflict.
That is one of the great changes in Israeli society that we've seen over the years, the idea now that the only way forward is separation, that
Right.
is the way. And that took root, I know, after, Oslo, and then the intifada that came from it, the Al-Aqsa intifada again. And then, post that now with Gaza, when Israel wasn't even present inside Gaza. Yes, I know we controlled the borders and so on, but we weren't even present on the ground, and still it's Al-Aqsa again. The threads of 1929 and your book is just so important because it gives an underlying understanding of this, the hardest tension of all, I think, Yardena, between historical truth and moral framing. And that is the world we're living in right now. This real conflict between truth and this morality as virtue, as likes and likes. So finally, if there's one misconception about this conflict that you'd like to correct, based on your understanding of 1929, the bad parts of it, the terrible parts, and the good parts of it, those that helped one another, what's that one misconception you'd correct, if you can, right now, so that we can get a path forward amidst the conflict as we know it now?
Well, there are many misconceptions about this conflict, but I think one of the most overarching misconceptions is this idea that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is about land and power, when really, as my book's title makes clear, this began as a holy war over holy land, and it continues to be a holy war over holy land. And I think the failure of so many Western leaders and organizations to address and confront the religious nature of the violence, the religious nature and the religious underpinnings of the conflict and the people driving the conflict, I think has been to the detriment of all involved. I think when you have an organization like Hamas, whose name means the Islamic Resistance Movement, fighting alongside an organization whose name needs no explanation, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Their name and their language tells you everything you need to know. They're not hiding the fact that for them this is a holy war. And yet, for some reason, for decades, the people trying to achieve peace have ignored those religious forces. And I think it's because so many in the West have a failure to grasp the role that religion plays for many people in the Middle East. I think, for many in the West, holy wars have not been fought for centuries. And yet, in the Middle East, holy wars are being fought not just, in Israel, Palestine, but throughout the Muslim world. And, that misconception is, I believe, why this conflict persists and why every peace effort has failed.
And what is your conclusion from that in terms of where we go from here in order to find the Hebron of the past without second-class citizens, but that idea, that idealism of coexistence that is possible? Where does that lead us?
Well, it might surprise those listening to this, at least those who haven't read my book, but I actually came away from this research feeling more optimistic about the future than I did before, because I came to know several Palestinians who represent to me what good Palestinian leadership could look like and should look like, and what it will look like if and when the international leaders start paying attention to the mistakes of the past and realizing that what they need to do is elevate and empower peace-seeking Palestinian moderates who reject Hamas and Islamic Jihad and recognize the failures of violent resistance to bring anything but more death and destruction upon the Palestinian people. And the reason we don't hear more from these voices is not only because the media, as a journalist, I can say this with confidence, not only because the media isn't interested in those stories, but also because, sadly, those people, unless they come from very prominent families, and don't need to fear for their lives, they can't speak out. And they can't form movements because they will be killed or intimidated or forced to flee the West Bank or Gaza, as many have done so in order to speak out. And so they need, for that to change, they need to be elevated and empowered and given the resources and support they need to become the future leaders of the Palestinian people.
And as many of us, on that positive note, as many of us believe and indeed know that leaders on both sides, leaders in Israel must change, and we all know that leaders on the Palestinian side must change. I'm often asked the question, Yardena, what would you do, Adam? What would you do if you and I think that the answer is simple. The first thing is you invite your counterpart in the Palestinian Authority to a game of soccer where it's an Arab Israeli soccer team playing, and you just show everybody that you can sit together.
Mhm.
And that's the hope in all of this, that the right leaders will come to the surface. And in your book, I got a deep, deep sense of the problem in the West around moral framing of an historically inaccurate understanding of what this is really all about.
Right.
Yardena, your book is Ghosts of a Holy War, is an incredible template for what we need to do today, as well as going into the history of a very, very dark moment in both, I think, Arab and Jewish history. Thank you so much for giving us your time to understand the resonant tones of the conflict that didn't begin in 1929, but when you stand there and then look forward, you see the repetitive misuse of history and morality in order to create conflict as opposed to peace. I, with you, when I read that book, realized that there is a real optimistic way ahead of us if the people who really want that will make that happen. Yardena, thank you so much. May your writing hand continue to be strong in giving us all this wonderful information and understanding. And it must have been an incredible journey for you to start in an attic of letters and to finish up with this incredible insight into the history of the conflict today. We wish you
Thank you
well
so much, Adam. Thank you. I really
so
appreciate
much.
it.
When you come
It
to
was fun.
Australia one day, of course you'll come to me and we will share a meal, but look forward to sharing your wonderful story with all our audiences.
Well, I would love to come to Australia. I've never been, but it's at the top of my list. And I've been doing book talks around the US and Canada since the book came out. So if anyone is interested in bringing me to Australia to do a talk there, I would love to come, and you will be my first stop.
I look forward to it. Welcome, Yardena. And that's a welcome to coming forward, or as we should say, inshallah, you will be with us. Look after yourself. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Adam. Take care.